Okay, welcome everyone to the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance program on surprise blessings during COVID-19. We have 5 or 6 interfaith religious leaders joining us this evening. We have another leader from our YANA New England chapter, Mick Hirsch, who's also a Divinity School graduate, who's going to be moderating the program. So I'm going to hand the speaker microphone over to him. We will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A function. To the extent you can ask questions that would be generally applicable to all panelists, that'd be terrific. We've asked the panelists if there's something particular to them, they will try to answer it, and we'll just want the program moving. So thank you again for joining us. Mick, I'm going to hand the mic over to you, let you do the introductions, and I'll put myself on mute and hang out in the background. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm so delighted to welcome all of you tonight to this special panel. I want to just say a few thank yous to really everyone at YANA, especially the New England and Washington, D.C. chapters, as well as the Yale Club of Houston, all of which are hosting this event tonight. Again, thank you to Rachel for her tremendous leadership, and Liana, who has done a lot in the background to help make this possible. The pandemic has certainly been the most comprehensively traumatic experience in my lifetime. We all know too well the pain and suffering it has caused from the grueling illness and far too many deaths, to job losses and small businesses having to close. In the international work that I do, you see the draconian directives that have been meant to terrorize the people far more than to protect them from the virus. And also internationally and nationally, the unconscionable increase in violence against women and children. I lead an organization that provides trauma recovery support for survivors of war and refugees. In the 20-some years that I have been doing this kind of work to heal the invisible wounds of psychological trauma, I've always sought to find that glimmer of hope in the darkness of despair. Tonight, COVID-19 still presses hard down upon us. 167 million cases, 3.4 million deaths. Sweden, Argentina, Brazil, India, even here in the United States. This illness still is. We are fortunate tonight to have assembled a panel of different traditions, people who will help us tonight to understand how faith, hope, and love, and I'm not just talking about a Christian Pauline formula, but something profoundly universal, how those three have helped and are continuing to help individuals and communities be surprised by some kind of light. Tonight, there will be 2 rounds of questions. Each panelist will have only 4 minutes to respond to each question. We are hoping for about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A from the audience. While we would love to field all questions, we will only be able to field a few. So please understand that, and we will do our best. Right now, I want to just very briefly, these are going to be abbreviated introductions, but I want to introduce all of our panelists up front. First, the very Reverend Randy Hollerith was named the 11th Dean of Washington National Cathedral in 2016. He holds degrees from Denison University and the Yale University Divinity School, class of 1990. Imam Omer Bajwa is the director of Muslim life at the chaplain's office at Yale. He earned his graduate certificate in Islamic chaplaincy from Hartford Seminary and has an MA in Near Eastern Studies with a specialization in Islamic Studies, as well as an MS in communication, both from Cornell University. The Reverend Sumi Loundon Kim is the Buddhist chaplain at Yale University, previously serving in the same role at Duke University for 8 years. She holds an MA in Buddhist Studies and Sanskrit from the Harvard Divinity School. She was originally brought up in a Soto Zen community in the 70s. Sumi now has been a student of the Theravada insight tradition since her teens. Amira Quraishi serves as college chaplain and Muslim life coordinator at Wellesley College. She earned an MA in religious studies from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA in Middle East studies from New York University. Since 2015, she has been co-founder and co-president of the Association of Campus Muslim Chaplains. Rabbi Victor Reinstein is the founding rabbi of Nehar Shalom Community Synagogue in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts, which he founded with his wife in 2004 as an egalitarian shtibel committed to traditional Jewish practice and progressive social and political values. He is an active member of the community Shevra Kadisha of Greater Boston, which is dedicated to the sacred ritual of caring for the dead. And unfortunately, we had one other panelist who was not able to make it tonight, but these five will be leading us in what I hope is a fabulous conversation. And the first question is going to go to Reverend Hollerith. Randy, your attendance seemed to explode during the pandemic. I personally, one day in March 2020, decided to log into a Washington National Cathedral worship service because the congregation I had loosely been attending did not have the technology to do online services. So I figured I never get a chance to worship at the National Cathedral, so now it's my opportunity. So I went once, and I think I've only missed 2 Sundays since March 2020. So Randy, on any given Sunday, there can be thousands of worshipers from scores of countries in practically every state in the union. How did it happen, and how did you keep people feeling connected?
Oh, that's such a great question. First, let me say, Mick, I'm really thrilled to be here with you all. Thank you for asking me and to be with such a distinguished panel. It's a pleasure. So quite frankly, I have to say that I call it grace, God's grace, or you can call it coincidence, or you can call it luck. But it just so happened that about 8 months before the pandemic hit, we invested a significant amount of money completely redoing the cathedral's audio and visual capabilities. Our older capabilities had been around for, I mean, literally, the camera system was held together by a VCR. I mean, it was pretty much out of date. And so we just luckily had raised the money and were able to do this. And it was part of the strategic plan, part of our 5-year strategic plan to build a digital cathedral. Well, I thought it would take us the better part of 5 years, and the pandemic hit, and we had to do it in about 5 weeks, which was quite an undertaking. We had to pivot everything, stand everything on its head. And our smallest department in the cathedral is the video, our editing and video department, literally 2 people, 1 primary person. And it was really surprisingly and wonderfully successful in the sense that we had video capabilities that many other churches didn't have. And so we were able to offer vibrant online worship experiences from the very beginning. And so we found that people around the country, Episcopalians around the country and others and around the world, began to gravitate towards our worship services. And it was such a joy to discover sort of out of the blue that this was the case. You know, a grand Gothic cathedral like the National Cathedral puts a lot of stock on the beauty of the building itself, on the power of that space to draw people in, on its kind of majesty and lifting one up to heaven, so to speak. And so the fact that we could gather community and create meaningful spiritual experiences for people when you really didn't have any more access to the building than what you were seeing on your screen was a really fascinating discovery for us, and wonderful. I don't think digital worship will ever replace in-person community gatherings for prayer and worship, but we found that it had a real life and a real place, and that there was real community in those people coming together.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And really, really coincidental, as you kind of mentioned about revamping your entire AV system and kind of way of doing things. So it's worked very, very well, and you can get a sense of that beautiful, magnificent cathedral just in watching. So there is something powerful that's going on there. My second question, I'd like to turn to Rabbi Reinstein. Now, Rabbi Reinstein, you're kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of size of congregation. You were the founding rabbi of a small but vibrant synagogue in Jamaica Plain in Massachusetts, in Boston. This community was very close, like a family, and I know that. I've also been there. I'm certain that the restriction on public gatherings was very hard on everyone there. What can you say about the way in which a small, close-knit faith community held together during COVID? And for example, even like how were religious holidays celebrated? And maybe if you have an extra minute, maybe you can also speak to what your personal experience was like providing pastoral care to individuals in that community.
Well, thank you, Mick. I think an important part of it I found was deep communication. And a shtibel is a very intimate religious setting from the Hasidic tradition that I had wanted to transplant to an egalitarian, more open setting. And the challenge was to keep that intimacy without being in each other's presence. And I have, through all the years, have written a weekly letter to my community and continued to do that, but shifting the focus with a real intention to touching where people were during this shared experience. I would regularly make phone calls to try to just check in on people. And I even started doing YouTube videos, which didn't last too long because I found it too daunting, technically and personally, to try to communicate in that way. And part of it was to continue communicating in ways that felt authentic to me. And it was important also to keep the cadence of the liturgical year and its seasons. We did a Passover Seder on Zoom the first year, and it was remarkable how well it worked, which I couldn't have imagined it would work as well as it did, with family of members joining in from around the country. So it was much larger than the annual community and public Seder that we hold. And then there were we did some Zoom services, but it was important to me to really try to balance what we did with an awareness of Jewish law and how to utilize electronics, for instance, on Shabbat. And it's very important to me not simply to put aside the usual requirements and challenges, but to work with those. And I think by working with them, rather than saying, well, we'll do whatever we need to do, it helped to deepen a sense of meaning in the journey. My role in the congregation changed once we were in the pandemic, which had been planned as I stepped back and became the founding rabbi rather than the active rabbi during that time. But I continued to teach, and I continue to teach now through the community. And one of the changes for me in teaching, which has been really fascinating and wonderful to me is really creating a pastoral dimension to all of my teaching. And so at the beginning of every class, weekly, I really try to check in with people and have worked to shape an opening question that gives people a chance to share where they are, but then looking at all that through the lens of Torah and trying to see this moment in time as also being timeless in the realm of Torah and Torah time, but felt even more so. And while we can look at all time in that way, it was even more so as we made our way through this time. I also have worked, as you referred to, in caring for the dead, both in a hands-on way and in teaching others to do that in the way of Jewish tradition. And that became a very important learning experience as we had to adapt our approach, learning to speak with the dead and to ask forgiveness, reassuring, affirming our loving presence, and trying to help people now as we shift back into our usual way to hold on to that depth of connection and intention as we return to our usual approaches.
Thank you so much, Victor. That's really fascinating how you just in a few minutes there you've walked through so many different ways in which you've really tried to engage with this experience on an individual and a communal level, and it's very powerful that you know, kind of the undergirding it all is the deep communication and the authenticity, and what I found especially interesting is the awareness of Jewish law that you really wanted to tend to, and that you didn't want to let that slip, even though you were being challenged in so many ways. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate your insight there. Now I'd like to turn to Amira. Amira is, as I mentioned, is the chaplain at Wellesley College, which is an all-women's college. Amira, I'm curious, what did you notice about the needs of women, and particularly Muslim women, at Wellesley College during COVID-19?
Well, thank you first of all, thank you all for having me. I'm so lucky to know many of you, have some overlapping history. I was actually just at Yale a few days ago, picking up my niece from college. She's a sophomore on field hockey, number 13. So if you're cheering them on, I got to pop in and see Omar. So it's really a joy to be here with you. So so the needs, I similar to my old friend Rabbi Victor as well. I work with a very small group of students at Wellesley College, which is already a small school to start with. But yes, it is a women's college, and but I think you know, I'll tell you a few things. But first, I think one thing that's just very universal to all of us is that students, I think, really needed to feel connected and grounded, and they needed to feel hope for the future. Those are the things that I heard from students. They would come to me with stress in their lives and some past grief and stress that would pop up because of COVID, because of the dire situations that they're hearing about, and the dire situations of, it's like everything just felt worse, and that stirred up feelings of everything that has been worse in their lives. So a lot of walks, a lot of listening, a lot of encouraging, and a lot of, like you've said, new ways to be connected. So videos and more emails and more phone calls, more Zoom, just whatever ways that they could feel connected to me and know that I was there for them. And ways that they could feel grounded, especially when the world felt like it was in chaos and their own history sometimes felt in chaos. I believed that they needed to feel grounded in an Islamic tradition that provided hope with perspective. So looking at the context of the Prophet Muhammad's life and the other prophets' lives in new ways that we could extract those lessons and apply them, and not just be gritting our teeth and waiting for the worst to happen or waiting for this to pass over, but actually activating the lessons, the practice, spiritual practices, the new perspectives, the new study in our lives. So doing more, finding new ways to help students discover the traditions of what we call dhikr, is remembrance of God, and putting it into practice in those moments of stress, and showing them how that the spiritual practice that they develop for themselves is going to help them through life, through all circumstances in life, both joyous and difficult, and to be empathetic with one another. It was very easy for me to do that part, especially because I'm somebody who is an open book. You can see my emotion on my face and my voice, and so they experienced my own grief and sadness with me, and I realized the benefit of helping them to express, or modeling for them how to express their sadness and their grief and their frustration in a very real and human way, always bookended by hope and faith that God created us in the best of molds, and that we can get through anything when we remember God, and that we can connect to one another with forgiveness and compassion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amira. That's a really interesting and important perspective. As someone who works with people who have been severely traumatized, one of the things that I saw so much is that that trauma from the past comes up into the present as well. And I think you're speaking to that as well, where this past history resurfaces and mingles with the present, which is in that moment, like you said, in chaos, and that can be kind of like this double overwhelming experience for people. So it certainly is important to have someone there who can kind of ground you and bring you back. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. And now I'd like to turn, it sounds like your friend Imam Bajwa, who is similarly a chaplain, a Muslim chaplain, only he is at Yale University. And so I'd like to turn to him now. My question for you, though, kind of goes in a bit of a different different trajectory. So COVID-19 has had not just an effect on gathering, but also on mobility. And my understanding is that one of the 5 pillars of Islam is Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. How did COVID-19 affect that? And maybe even a bit more generally, could you comment on how COVID-19 affected Islam in the United States and even internationally?
Sure. Thank you very much to YANA for organizing this. Thank you to my co-panelists here. Really excited to be here, and I'm writing down notes, right, with this. So really to just honor the time and to jump into the question is, indeed, Hajj is one of the 5 pillars. It's very it's very picturesque, right? You have 3 million people. It's the largest annual religious gathering of its kind. It is a logistical undertaking of the highest order, right? And I just want to, I'm a critic of the Saudi government for many reasons, but I want to give credit where credit is due, is that they do a phenomenal job when it comes to managing 3 million people from around the world, right? I've done Hajj many times and I lead groups. And in fact, to answer the question, I was scheduled to take a Hajj group last year when the lockdown happened, and it was kind of touch and go. No one knew in March what, July and August were going to look like. Obviously, as we now know, it got worse and worse and worse. So Hajj was obviously canceled. So what they did was, went from 3 million to just a few thousand. So I think to sort of honor the ritual the government's made the right call, which is that you cut it by like 95% of the population, and you have a sort of almost a symbolic Hajj, so that it took place that year. Many people were heartbroken. I'm privileged and blessed as a group leader. I am invited to take groups every year. Most of the 1.8 billion Muslims in the world will maybe get it to do it once in their lifetime if they're able, right? And so I'm sure there were people that were planning on it, that it just didn't happen, right? It literally evaporated. So that's a whole other sort of spiritual pastoral care concern. But I just want to say that I was literally in a conversation earlier today with a friend who's taking a Hajj group this July, and there's still a lot of ambiguity, right? And uncertainty is that the Saudis may have it, but they might dramatically cut the numbers and keep it small. And so the point being is that one of the major rituals of Islam, which is also very sort of, scenic and people visually can recognize it, was dramatically impacted. To the second part of the question, what I'll say is, Ramadan is also fasting in Ramadan is also one of the major pillars of Islam. And so last year, Ramadan, we just ended Ramadan actually 2 weeks ago, right, globally. So it's the holiest time of the entire year for the Muslim global community. And, last year it was a severe lockdown where mosques are full, people they fast all day, but they have iftars, they do fast breaking meals with family, friends, neighbors, neighboring congregations. All our college campuses, all our congregations really open their doors and invite everyone. And everything came to a screeching halt last year, right? Where we just, the Zoom iftar became a thing, right? You're sitting there with a friend or family member and like at sunset breaking, meal. And the rabbi said, sort of Zoom seders, like these are all new uncharted territory for many of us. I did that with my family and friends last year. It was really crushing for many students, because Ramadan, for many of our students that, are challenged by academics and other life concerns, Ramadan is the one time of the year where they reconnect with the community. And so what does it mean at the one time of the year that you're looking for connection, that is put on hold? And so as, Amira and many others have reflected is we have to sort of give them theological frames on how to interpret these events. So the last thing, and then I'll turn it over, is, that was last Ramadan where the mosques are full. You have extra devotional prayers where you recite the entire Quran from beginning to end over the course of 30 days. We discovered live streaming, Facebook Live, Insta Live, Ramadan prayers from the mosque. The Imam would lead in an empty mosque and we'd be, sort of Zooming and following. That became a thing. This past Ramadan, however, obviously the situation's gotten better, so mosques cautiously open. But the last thing I'll say is, it was a learning experience for all of us. And I think what I took away with it, and I think I talked to my community about, is that, resilient faith that takes time and effort to nurture. There is a strong communal element in all of our respective faiths, but resilient faith also has to be able to operate, when you're in a state of solitude. And it has to really be able to get you through that. So it's, I think, learning to navigate both. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imam Bajwa. That was everyone here is offering so many interesting perspectives. We could probably go on for days. But thank you for sharing about some of these traditions like Hajj and Ramadan and how it was affected. Actually, one of the things I find fascinating is how the last thing you said about resilient faith. I like that very much. I love that term, resilient faith, and how it takes time to nurture, and yet and how important it is, especially in a time of solitude, like you said. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to Sumi Kim, who is the Buddhist chaplain at Yale University. Sumi, in our email exchange about tonight, you were struck, I think, by the title of tonight's event. In some ways very similar to my own response to the title, and that I tried to articulate a little bit in my opening remarks, but also in ways that are uniquely Buddhist and even personal. So Sumi, I wonder if you might be able to help us bridge the first and second rounds of our questions by taking on just one question total and help us to get thinking from a spiritual perspective about what this virus has done to us and is doing to us. I'm curious about how have some Buddhist practitioners approached the challenges of the pandemic, including yourself. So maybe you can take on a rather direct question. What surprise blessing happened for you as a result of the pandemic?
Yes, I do love this question, and it comes at exactly the right time as my own family shifts from lockdown mode into some semblance of normalcy, 0 to 100 in just a few days. And so it's a wonderful moment to reflect on the last 14, 15 months. Much of what my colleagues shared resonates so much with me. I am going to share personally, even though my own story here is particular to me, I think it might invoke some shared or universal experiences. So in the fall of 2020, as the Yale semester got underway, the Yale Buddhist community hosted a Zen teacher who's also an environmental scientist. And partway through, she paused and asked, why is it that humanity seems to make so little progress on this very urgent question of the climate emergency? And she posited two reasons. One is that most people are just trying to get through a day, a week. You know, they're just trying to secure their home and employment and education. But perhaps more importantly, the second factor is that many, perhaps even a majority of people, come from trauma or are experiencing trauma. It's interesting that we've brought this up already in our conversation. She points to the statistic for women in the United States that 1 in 3 will have experienced sexual assault. In her home country of India, it's 1 in 2. There are many who come from alcoholic families, from families with mental illness or have mental illness themselves. And so not just getting through a day on a practical level, but so many of us are holding psychological wounds that need healing. How are we supposed to save the world on top of that? As we entered this pandemic lockdown, I was already experiencing some poor health, and I knew that from research that children from adverse childhoods often experience poor health later in life, in their adult lives. And so even though I had tried to address my chronic health issues, which were beginning to spiral into disability through Western medicine, Eastern medicine, and everything under the sun, things I never thought I would try, still I was having issues. And so I realized that I really would have to address my own complex trauma from childhood. I had already done quite a bit of therapy and had, of course, mindfulness practice and the Buddhist tradition to support me. And that was more in my 20s, but it hadn't quite gotten me to where I wanted to be. And I was somewhat dreading having to go into this deeper healing mode because all I knew was a prevailing modality of the last 50 years, which is to excavate memories and in detail with a therapist, which many people find re-traumatizing. Fortunately, a neighbor who is going through the same journey put me onto some books that provide more recent research on how to work with trauma. And so I began reading, and I must say that the pandemic entirely enabled this deep dive, not only through reading, but also doing very intensive personal work. So I want to share a little bit about that. I began with Norman Doidge's books, The Brain's Way of Healing and The Brain That Changes Itself. This is about neuroplasticity and the remarkable discovery that the brain, our thoughts, has the power to change the structure and function of our own brains. And so then I thought, well, this is pretty cool, and started to learn about, well, how do you actually do that? And you can do that through various protocols like dynamic neural retraining systems, in which there are practical ways, thank you for these references on the chat, of rewiring the brain. And I did see some change in my health as I began to do these protocols. And joyfully, I saw that this is very much in line with the Buddhist understanding of mind and the Buddhist practices, and I'm happy to say for my colleagues, very much in line with what religious traditions offer in terms of practices that can be thought of in some ways as a brain retraining. This then took me into working with the breath. James Nestor's book, Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art, gave me a much clearer idea of how Buddhists use the breath in meditation and how breath can be related both to poor health, but also to better health. From the brain, I began reading more about the nervous system. And although for years as a Buddhist teacher, I taught about sympathetic versus parasympathetic, this dual understanding of the nervous system, it turns out that the research shows we actually have 3 parts of the nervous system, providing clarity that there's fight and flight in the sympathetic, and then there is freeze, which is dorsal vagal. And once we understand how the nervous system is working and which fight or flight or freeze response is happening, we can hack the system. And so I began learning about what a very practical method of resetting the nervous system, of soothing and of reconditioning the nervous system from trauma through a practice called somatic experiencing. And this is Peter Levine's work. Many of my colleagues in the Buddhist world have begun incorporating somatic experiencing in their meditation teaching, in part because we do see so many people with trauma coming into our spaces. Beautifully, again, somatic experiencing uses mindfulness of the body to understand the connection to emotions and to the mind. And so really it's highly compatible. And I found that as I undertook these practices, it actually went back into my meditation practice. And whereas in previous times I may have struggled with meditation, as so many of us do, now meditation was become quite natural and much easier. So I could feel healing beginning to take root. The somatic experiencing person I worked with said, who's also a meditator, you should take a look at this book, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, because we now understand that although meditation is pretty much a universal benefit, it's hard to go wrong with it, there can be, for people who come into meditation with trauma, ways in which meditation can reactivate trauma. A person can experience flooding, flashbacks. For me, for example, when I sit very still, at first it's very calming, but it's so similar to the freeze response that I can inadvertently end up meditating in a freeze response. So I've learned new methodologies for teaching meditation to traumatized individuals. That's been enormously helpful. And I've explored other things like internal family systems developed by Richard Schwartz, and I've begun reading about psychedelic assisted therapy, which has profound implications, the use of MDMA and psilocybin for treating depression and PTSD, and research on that is being done right here at our very own Yale, and I think this shows tremendous promise. So as I've been coming out of the pandemic, I'm happy to say that many of my chronic health issues have in fact lifted, and I come out of it stronger, more grounded. But most importantly, I think I now have a much broader palette of ways of teaching, of being a Buddhist teacher, and that I can, really meet people in the stress and suffering that they're coming with. And so perhaps, we might not solve the climate crisis tomorrow. I certainly won't. I do feel that the surprise blessing is that I have been able to turn, and I hope to help other people to turn from the walking wounded into the walking well. And perhaps we can bring healing to the communities and the world around us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sumi. That's a powerful testimony, and thank you for even being a little vulnerable to share a personal story like that with us in our community. But I think there's something about how we did all become more vulnerable, I think, and how we did all have some self-reflection that kind of opened us in profound ways and special ways that we tend to be so closed, especially in our culture, and so I really appreciate that you that you kind of went through that journey, that it was a positive journey for you, and that you're doing better, and that you also have this experience to share and pass on to others in your chaplaincy and ministry. Thank you. Victor, I'm going to come back to you, Rabbi Victor, and I'm going to ask you something that's somewhat similar. As a rabbi, how do you hold the idea of blessings emerging from tragedy? And you already talked a little bit about your teaching and how you use Torah, and you've been bringing some pastoral care at the beginning of your teaching lessons. But are there any Jewish teachings, maybe specifically, that inform the way that you understand this tension for yourself and as you respond to the needs of others during this hard time?
Ooh, it's really a hard question. And an important one. I have to acknowledge that I have a hard time speaking of blessings emerging from tragedy. I can't help but feel the shadow of the Holocaust, for instance, or the pogroms that my grandparents were scarred for life by. I find it theologically difficult to risk minimizing tragedy, wary of engaging in justification of God's decree in human terms, a dialectic we call in Hebrew tziduk hadin, justifying the decree. I prefer to think of lessons rather than blessings emerging from tragedy. Yet I'm concerned about the lessons as well. There's so many lessons from this time that we should have already known. The artifice of borders, and yet they're all too real. We look at the pain brought to immigrants by borders, and yet we've learned how porous borders are to a virus. We've learned the lesson again and again and again of the frailty of the human condition, and also its resilience and strength. We've yet again had opportunity to learn to hear each other's cries. None of these are new lessons. They're such important lessons that have come through this time, but I struggle with that tension, and they're not being new. Can we hold something deeper this time? I hear my own words, and I need to quickly say that I am not a hard-bitten person. In truth, I'm quite optimistic and always endeavor to see the good, but I struggle with that sense of blessing from tragedy. Perhaps it is that in our business, we have all seen too much tragedy on so many levels. I prefer not to think in terms that I could not or would dare not use among the grieving. If there is a theological construct that I find helpful, I find that construct to be judged ultimately in whether I can share it with those who are grieving. And if not, there's something short, something incomplete with that construct. I am drawn to a Jewish understanding that God cries with us in our grief. There's a beautiful telling of two great tears falling into the sea each night at midnight as God weeps for us. And so I am comforted. I turn now and always most readily to God who cries. The challenge now and always, as I feel it, is is still to see the beauty in the midst of tragedy. We live in the valley of the shadow of death. That is where human life unfolds. The valley is this world, and the challenge is to choose life, nevertheless, and yet to see the beauty, to be able to say, as Anne Frank did, I still believe that people really are good at heart.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Victor, for those reflections, which are also deeply personal and yet really strike, I think, all of us in our hearts. This notion of blessings from tragedy is something that we do struggle with, we continue to struggle with, and the lessons are continuously learned and forgotten, and that is one of our biggest challenges. I think also as faith leaders that we challenge the image of God weeping, of crying, and two great tears falling into the sea at midnight is very powerful. Thank you for sharing that image with us as well. Amira, I'm going to turn back to you. Now, you already talked a bit about modeling, certain kind of response, a certain kind of character traits for the students that you serve. You said I'm an open book. Modeling for them how to express their grief and frustration. I wonder, would you be able to share a little bit more around that? Because I think that is a really important role that applies not just to people who have a sort of kind of public ministry, but to the way that we just interact with others. How do we maintain that strength sometimes when we're feeling hurting?
Oh, that's a tough question. I actually think I go back to a word I liked that Rabbi Victor used, cadence. I think that, so I'll tell you, when I didn't know it at the time, but when I was maybe about 22, a little older than my students are, I didn't know that this moment in my life would be a catalyst, I think, for me ending up in chaplaincy. But I was the head counselor at it was Muslim Youth of North America camp, week-long camp it was in the winter, it was in Detroit. And the heat went out in the middle of the night. So we heard some voices in the night waking us up, telling all the women to go into the main lodge where there was heat. I don't know what they did with the boys, but they put all the girls in the main lodge with our pillows and our sleeping bags. We slept there. And then the sun was about to rise and we didn't hear any male voices. Usually you hear a male voice giving the call to prayer for the sunrise prayer. We didn't hear any male voices, and the girls started getting a little concerned and came to me. And I just, like any other Muslim woman, just assumed the men are going to take care of it, right? There's a default to the men doing this. And I realized that wasn't going to happen. And they would say, what do we do? And they came to me because they said I was the next highest in rank. Like there was the director and he wasn't there. The curriculum director wasn't there. It was me. And I said, well, we pray. So we establish what we call the deen, the practice of the faith. We keep the cadence. And in that moment, I ended up leading Fajr, what's called Fajr prayer, for 100 women. And some girls came up to me afterwards and said, and they cried because they had never been led by women in spiritual practice. And I think I realized in that moment how important it is for women to feel some autonomy, some spiritual leadership, Muslim women, to feel that they can establish the community for themselves. I don't want to say they don't need men, but they don't need the men, and not in the sense that it's our own personal responsibility to our faith, to the example of the Prophet Muhammad, and all those who followed him, which is because of all the people who followed him, we have what we have today, and we are responsible for maintaining it for our own lives and for the community. So that's what I try to establish at Wellesley College. And this was a similar situation where there were no male voices, you know, calling us to go to the mosque for Ramadan Taraweeh prayers. There were no male voices calling us to say, hey, we have the Eid prayers ready and available for you. We had to do it ourselves. So, and I knew how important it was. Omer talked about the importance of gathering, especially in Ramadan. So I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to lose the cadence. I didn't want to minimize women's ability and spiritual depth. And so, and I also knew that I couldn't do it all on my own. It is hard to lead every Friday prayer, to lead every evening prayer, to lead every late night Taraweeh prayer in Ramadan. So I worked with our community, with our students, and I modeled, and I encouraged, and they stepped up, and they led the evening prayers every night. We got together to break fast, and they led the evening prayers. They led the late night Taraweeh prayers. I led the Eid prayers and gave an Eid khutbah, which is possibly the first, if not, I mean, I don't know, I mean, an all women's Eid prayer where I gave the khutbah, and it was so lovely to reflect back to them in my message what their community had built, and that it was built on their own experiences of what they had the trouble that they had and the difficulty they had, and how they rose above their challenges and built this experience together. And the celebration on Eid Day was so lovely because of that. I think they felt their own accomplishment, and they felt that they really had built a new community, which never would have happened if we hadn't been under lockdown like this.
Wow, that is an incredibly powerful story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, really just something that I'm going to tell my daughter. So, she's gonna graduate from Simmons University, another women's college, in 4 days from now. So, but I think she would really like that story. It's a story of empowerment, and she loves that. So, thank you for sharing. I'm going to turn back to Imam Bajwa and ask you a little bit about your chaplaincy and your community at Yale. The faith community that you serve is also students, although I imagine that you've got some faculty and staff and others. But as with nearly all universities, Yale eventually closed its doors because of the COVID-19. And your local ummah, if I understand the term correctly, your community kind of scattered in many directions. So how did you continue to serve students both individually and as a community during that time?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you to all the wonderful answers so far. Again, taking notes here. But on that question, you know, I think there's two things that I'll mention. Number one is, you know, we very quickly, Yale, I think I remember the date was like March 13th, 2020, when there was a national lockdown announced. Our students were away on spring break, and many of them, they just left their stuff behind, right? Thinking they're going on spring break. They couldn't come back. They literally were like, we will mail you the stuff, right? Yale said, we'll mail you the stuff. You cannot come back to get this. And that had its own sort of chaos to it. But to answer your question, the two things that we did was, you know, myself and my amazing colleagues like Sumi and others, we pivoted. I had never used Zoom before that, right? There's a steep learning curve, like Randy said before, is that, you know, you have to figure these things out really quickly. So we moved our Friday prayer services to Zoom. We went virtual to our weekly study circles, and we've been going 15 months, right, on these weekly Zoom sessions, which, you know, has pros and cons. But the one takeaway that I will say is that, you know, so much of with students is that they are inundated, they're overwhelmed with work, with lost internships, lost trips, lost family time, lost classes, and all of that. So I just made an effort to do a lot of one-on-one check-ins, you know, phone calls, text messages, WhatsApp, you know, a Zoom, In fact, I prefer phone calls over Zoom, I think, right, to check in on students. But you know, we all use whatever means we had at our disposal to just do a lot of check-in on one-on-ones with students. And they're heartbreaking, right? I mean, I had students that are halfway around the world that are like, I'm stuck at home. It's an unsafe learning environment. It's an unsafe emotional and physical environment. I'm calling you from my closet right now because things are really tense at home, you know, the odd hours of the night. But I mean, we've all been there. We've done that for our congregations and parishioners before. And this was sort of just jumping in the deep end with that. That's what I would say, honestly, what we had to do, whereas before, you know, you could go out, grab a cup of coffee or sit on a bench or have a one-on-one pastoral session in an office. We just had to pivot. I think one of the other interesting things that I will mention, though, and then I'll turn it over, is, you know, normally we have a very beautiful, robust, you know, weekly gathering, the Friday service at Yale, which is open to student, staff, faculty, community. Anyone can walk in off the street and attend our services. What I noticed is when we moved online is, you know, and I think some of my other panelists have talked about this as well, is that there were people that maybe couldn't have attended before because of work, because of other commitments, because they're caregiving, they're just elsewhere. They can't come on a Friday at 1 o'clock. You know, there are people that started joining our online community that I knew existed in our orbit, but didn't see very often. And then they became regulars. And they were just like, you know, I wanted to come in the past, but I couldn't. But thank you for creating this virtual access point and this space. And, you know, I couldn't have come, but I'm here now. And it's been a real sort of breath of fresh air. So I think that I want to say that there's, if I may, you know, the silver lining in a sense to look at, you know, what was possible from this abrupt shift online.
Thank you so much. Again, one of the final things that you said is I love the term. I hadn't heard it before. Virtual access space. You know, really fascinating and absolutely spot on. I think that there are so many individuals that had been denied opportunities to engage in worship services, and even being able to go back, because all of these things were recorded, and then, you know, you could they were archived, and you could go back, you know, in my tradition of Christianity, you could go back and watch the Easter Day service. You know, I could watch it tonight if I wanted to, you know, and make Easter today, because I wasn't able to participate, you know, back a month ago. So very interesting. And now I'm going to turn it over for the last question. I know we're getting a little short on time, but I want Reverend Hollerith to have enough time to respond, and then maybe if people are able and willing, they can stick around just a little bit for at least one or two Q&As. But Reverend Hollerith, my second question for you is also about something that I think is both individual and communal in extraordinary ways, and that's something about the sacrament of the Eucharist. Also known as communion. It's the breaking and sharing of the bread and wine. And the Eucharist is something that is so central to many Christian denominations, especially the Episcopal Church. Can you talk, how were you able to preserve this element of worship, given the fact that worshipers could not physically receive and ingest the sacrament, but also that the congregation could not kneel together as a Christian community at the altar rail?
Thank you, Mick. That's a great question, and one that we early on in the pandemic wrestled with, quite frankly. What could we do and what shouldn't we do, quite frankly, when it comes to that sacrament in the Christian context? There were lots of our brothers and sister churches who decided that during this pandemic, while they were broadcasting their services, they weren't going to do Eucharist. They would switch to simply some morning prayers. And there were many dioceses who decided that that's what all their churches should do. Here in the Diocese of Washington, we had some leeway to do what we thought was best. And for us, the Eucharist was such a central, not that it wasn't for others, but for us, it was such a central piece of cathedral worship that we wanted to continue it. But we didn't want to continue it in such a way where those of the few of us who were in the building were able to take part in the sacrament physically, while the several thousand, up to 10,000 folks who were watching us were not able to do so. It sort of struck us in that rather medieval way when the clergy would take the bread or the wine, and the lay people often wouldn't get anything, which is not a good memory, quite frankly, in the history of the church. So we decided that we would just make it spiritual communion, that we would actually break the bread and bless the wine, but that none of us would physically receive it. No one in the cathedral, none of the few of us in the cathedral, and of course, not those of our friends who were at home, but that instead we would place that prayer after we broke the bread and blessed the cup, a prayer for spiritual communion, when we invited Christ into our hearts, since we could not take him physically in the bread and the wine. And I have to say that personally, while I really missed taking part in that sacrament all those months, that spiritual prayer was a deep reminder every Sunday about the importance of that spiritual connection that goes beyond that physical bread and wine connection. And we found that it was meaningful for folks who were tuning in from home.
Thank you so much. And as someone who participated in those services, I would say absolutely. There were many reasons why I continued to go back Sunday after Sunday to the Washington National Cathedral. One is the beautiful music. Two is just being able to see the site. Three is the preaching. But really, that opportunity to still receive such an important sacrament was very important to me. So thank you, and to your church for doing that. Now we have come to the end of the questions that were prepared for the panelists. As I said, I was hoping to get us at the 7:30 marker. We're right at it right now, but I would be happy to offer a few questions to the panelists. So I'm going to try to see here what we have. Okay, how about this? So I have one question here, which is kind of, I think, up for anyone. The question is, building on Amira's stories, that powerful story that she just shared about her own kind of calling to chaplaincy. I am curious about new/surprising ways that you all have come to understand your roles as faith leaders, or your traditions themselves, in light of the enormity of the past 15 months. So a question about how you understand your roles as faith leaders and even your larger traditions. And anyone who wants to can unmute yourself and respond to that. Although it may take 10 minutes to think about. It's not an easy question.
I'll jump in. I found two things. One was I was surprised by the durability of my tradition. It felt, especially in the first few months, as the waters of suffering began to rise and like threaten survival emotionally, psychologically, that it felt like the Buddhist practice and tradition that I had practiced for so many years was like a boat that kept me floating. And I was really pleased to see how the investment in all that practice and training actually came to bear. And I know that this was shared by many, many of the people I know who follow this tradition. The other very beautiful thing that that changed for me and others is to pick up on the word vulnerability that came out earlier. Is that, maybe it's something about the online experience or the rawness of the last 15 months, but people began to shed the veneer of, especially here at Yale, of all the pretensions and, what the facades that we use with each other, and kind of got more real. And I think I found myself becoming even more responsive to that. Trying to find a way not to overshare, right? But to share just enough to, so that that we were in conversation with each other. And it was such a rich and rewarding new space to explore, because we were more co-learning and co-sharing. And sometimes I would have surprising insights. You know, here I am 46 and maybe talking to a 20-year-old or something, you know, and, you know, we're both having surprising new discoveries. It was a really lovely aspect that's changed for me.
I'll jump in and say that one of the things we're discovering that about our roles that push us is that we are now having to, the blessing of having to wrestle with what does it mean to have a cathedral congregation without walls? You know, when you have folks who want to be a part of your community who live in Minneapolis or they live in southern Spain, but that they have found a connection in the worship services and in the, we also started offering coffee hours after the worship services, a national coffee hour, which, you know, people just gather on Zoom and talk. But people began to be fed and found community there. So how do we minister? That's one of the great challenges. How do we begin to minister to those folks who are not physically with us, but who are still committed to be engaging with us in this digital format as we move forward, as we come out of this pandemic?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Randy, as well, for those things. That question, how do we minister in this time is very interesting. We are getting a little late. If there's any other panelist who wants to chime in, we can do that, or we can start to think about wrapping up. Anyone else like to have a stab at the question? Okay, not hearing anybody. I think we are going to, not to rush off, but I think we are going to respect people's time and say goodnight. I want to thank all of our panelists. This was a truly fascinating conversation. I almost wish this was a weekly affair where we could come together and have these conversations. I think we could, you know, really get even deeper and learn a lot from each other, from the different traditions that we've encountered tonight. So I want to thank all of the panelists. Again, I want to thank YANA for their superb work within the Yale community, as well as opening up to the outside community as well. I want to kind of just direct you to the YANA website and to other events that we have coming up. There are always many different events, and we would be happy to invite you to all of those. So thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.
Honor.
So much. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.